A lot of people say they want to start a business because they want freedom. Freedom from their boss, freedom from the 9 to 5, freedom to decide when they work, where they work, and what they work on. And then they start a business and somehow they end up working from 7 in the morning until 11 at night. They answer customer messages while eating, they solve supplier problems on Sunday, and they approve every payment while sitting on the toilet seat. They make every important decision. They are the salesperson, the customer service department, the operations manager, the accountant, and sometimes even the delivery person. Congrats! You successfully escaped your job and created a much more demanding job for yourself. And this is something I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't realize. There's a big difference between owning a business and simply owning your own job. So this video is really about one thing. How dependent is your business on you? And if the answer is very dependent, how do you gradually change that? Okay, first, I want to make something clear. There is absolutely nothing wrong with being self-employed. Some people deliberately choose that, and they deliberately want that. You may be a consultant, a designer, a lawyer, doctor, freelancer, or someone who simply enjoys doing the actual work. And in any of these scenarios, self-employment can actually be great. You have more control, you choose your clients, you may earn significantly more than you would as an employee. And research has repeatedly found that self-employed people often report very high levels of job satisfaction. So, this is not about saying self-employment is bad and big company is good. Not at all. The real issue is dependency. The problem is when you think you are building an asset, i.e. a business, when what you are actually building is employment for yourself. You can have a registered company, employees, a fancy office, a website, and hundreds of customers. You can even make a lot of money and still have a business that cannot function properly without you. And obviously, this is not a black and white situation. Think of it more like a spectrum. At one end, the business depends almost entirely on your personal labor. If you stop working, most of the work and often most of the income stops with you. So your business is more like a self-employed job because it primarily makes money because you work. At the other end, there are businesses that keep functioning without you being personally involved in every transaction. Most businesses sit somewhere between these two, and almost every business starts heavily dependent on its founder. So the important question is, does your business become less dependent on you as it grows, or whether it starts depending on you more? So how does business become so dependent on its owner in the first place? Michael Gerber explains one of the most common ways this happens in the book, The E-Myth Revisited. He describes what you could call the technician trap. Imagine someone who is an amazing baker. She works for someone else, and one day she thinks, I make the pies, and customers love my pies, and my boss is making the money. Why don't I open my own bakery? Which obviously sounds very reasonable. So she starts her own bakery. Except now, she doesn't just make pies. She has to buy the ingredients, she has to manage the inventory, she has to hire people, deal with customers, do the marketing, pay the bills, and then handle the taxes, and deal with employees who suddenly don't come to work today, and still make the pies. So the mistake was assuming that just because you know how to do the technical work, you also automatically know how to build a business around that work. Making great pies is one skill. Building a company that can consistently make, sell, and deliver those pies without depending entirely on you is another. Those are two very different skills. A great hairdresser doesn't automatically know how to build a great salon. A brilliant accountant doesn't automatically know how to build an accounting firm. A good engineer doesn't automatically know how to build an engineering company. And this is where entrepreneurship becomes quite funny. When you were employed, you had one boss. Then you start a business because you don't want a boss. And 6 months later, you discover that you now have suppliers, employees, landlords, banks, and 200 customers telling you what they need. In fact, now you have many bosses. So much for freedom. Now, at the beginning, doing all of this by yourself might actually work. The business is small, there are not that many customers or decisions, and somehow you can still keep everything under control. But then the business starts growing, and strangely, the same person who was holding everything together at the beginning can eventually become the person holding everything up. And that brings us to the next problem. The founder becomes the bottleneck. This usually happens very innocently. When a business is tiny, it actually makes sense for the founder to do almost everything, right? You have 3 customers, so of course you talk to all 3 of them. You have only 1 employee, so of course they ask you questions and you know the product better than anyone. So at that stage, you probably should be heavily involved. It all makes perfect sense. Okay, so when does the problem starts? The problem comes when the company grows, but the way the company operates doesn't. Say, now you have 10 employees, 50 customers, 3 suppliers, hundreds of transactions. But every road still leads back to you. Customer wants a refund, ask the owner. Supplier changes their price, ask the owner. Employee wants to offer a discount, ask the owner. Someone needs to buy a new printer. Apparently, we also need the CEO for that. At some point, the founder who created the company becomes the biggest bottleneck inside it. And this is one of the strange things about growing a business, because the qualities that help you survive in the beginning can hurt you later. Doing everything yourself is useful when you have no money. Controlling every decision might protect quality when you have 3 customers. But once the company becomes bigger, those same habits can stop the company from growing. So if every road leads back to you, growth of your business eventually becomes limited by one thing: you. Okay, but how do you actually know how dependent the business has become on you? One very simple way is to imagine that you are suddenly not there. If you stop working for 4 weeks, what would happen to your business? Would it simply slow down a little? Or would the whole thing start falling apart? Mike Michalowicz explores essentially this idea in the book Clockwork. He calls it the 4-week vacation test. Basically, could you leave your business for 4 weeks? And by leaving, he means completely leave. Not working remotely, not working online, not answering WhatsApp every evening, not secretly checking your email from the beach. He means actually disappearing for 4 weeks. And so, would the business still function? Could customers still buy? Could orders still be processed? Could employees make normal decisions? Could someone solve a customer complaint? Would invoices still be paid? Would marketing continue? Would money still come in? Because if absolutely everything stops when you stop, then you have discovered something important. You are not simply working in the business. You are the operating system of the business. And that makes your business very vulnerable, because think of it, even if you don't want a month-long holiday, life occasionally removes you from your business, whether you plan for it or not. You might have a baby, one of your parents might become sick, you might get sick. You may simply need a break, or maybe you finally want enough time to write that book you have been talking about for 20 years. So, a business that gives you no option to step away is not that great of a business in the first place. So, how do you start changing that? This is why boring things like systems matter so much. Yes, spending time creating boring systems like, say, for your customer refunding procedure. That is not a task that appears that important, but that boring document might actually give you more freedom and make your business more business-like than you might otherwise imagine. Think about McDonald's. The genius of McDonald's was never that every restaurant somehow found world-class chefs. Quite the opposite. The company built systems so that an ordinary employee could repeatedly produce a predictable result. And that is really the shift that you are trying to make in your own business. Instead of asking, how can I personally do this perfectly? You start asking, how can this be done properly even when I'm not here? So you can build systems around almost anything: customer onboarding, sales follow-up, inventory, quality control, hiring, financial reporting, and all those boring recurrent tasks that somehow consume half of your week. And the other thing is, a system doesn't have to be some 96-page corporate manual that nobody reads. Sometimes it can simply be some if and then statements. Like, when this happens, do these 5 things. This person is responsible. They have the authority up to this point. And if something unusual happens, only then escalate it. Only then does it come back to you. It is that simple. So, like that, you can use systems to move the knowledge out of your head and into the organization, making the business less dependent on you. The second solution people usually reach for is more people, basically hiring. And yes, sometimes that's exactly the right thing to do. But more people by itself will not make your business less dependent and more of a real business. There's an actual wonderful historical example of this. In the 1950s, a British historian called C. Northcote Parkinson was studying government bureaucracy, and he noticed something quite ridiculous. Britain had once controlled this enormous empire, but by the middle of the 20th century, that empire was rapidly shrinking as colonies became independent. So logically, you would expect the department administering those colonies to shrink as well, right? Less empire means less administration. Pretty straightforward. Instead, the bureaucracy kept growing. More officials, more administrators, more people supervising other people. Parkinson turned observations like this into what became known as Parkinson's law. His point was that organizations have an extraordinary ability to generate work for themselves. Businesses can fall into exactly the same trap. For example, when you hire a manager for your business, the manager might request for an assistant. And this assistant creates reports. And then someone has to review the reports. Then you also need someone to coordinate the people reviewing the reports. So eventually you have a meeting to discuss why nobody has enough time to do the actual work. So just hiring people to delegate stuff is not enough. You have to be good at delegation too. The difference between good delegation versus bad delegation is good delegation is about delegating the responsibility, while the bad delegation often involves just delegating the tasks. For example, the bad delegation, the task delegation, sounds something like call this customer, send this invoice, order this product, something like that. But delegating responsibility sounds more like telling someone that he or she is responsible for the customer support of the company, and here is our company policy, here is the outcome we want, and here is what you can decide yourself, and these are the situations you need to bring to me. That's very different from merely delegating a task. Good delegation requires people to know what results they are responsible for, what decisions they can make, what standards they are expected to meet, and when something genuinely needs escalation. And there is another trap here. I don't want anyone watching this video to think that the goal is to build some giant 500-person company, because it is not. I recommend reading the book Company of One by Paul Jarvis, because he explains this idea beautifully. Staying small is sometimes actually the smart strategy. You can have one person or 3 people business and still make excellent profits and have a genuinely great business. Meanwhile, you can have 50 employees and still have a company where every important decision goes through the founder. So the number of employees is not the important part. Dependency is. Small doesn't necessarily mean self-employed, and big doesn't necessarily mean independent. So the real question is, how much does this organization depend on your constant presence? Okay. Another thing that you can do to decrease dependency of your business on you is to increase your leverage. Imagine you are an excellent consultant charging $200 an hour. If you work 10 hours, you make $2,000, 20 hours, $4,000, 40 hours, $8,000. That's potentially a fantastic income. But the relationship is still very simple. No hours, no money. Again, nothing wrong with that if that is the life that you want. But if you want to build something that is less dependent on you personally, eventually you have to ask one important question. How do I separate revenue from my personal hours? You might figure out different answers to this question. Maybe instead of completely custom work every single time, you create a standardized service. Maybe you hire and train other people to deliver a part of your service. Maybe you develop a software, a course, a subscription, a product, licensing, intellectual property, or any other kind of automation. So like this, you can start creating leverage in your business. Then 1 hour of your work begins affecting 10 transactions, then 100, then maybe thousands. This is also one of the central ideas behind John Warrilow's book, Built to Sell. The more completely a business depends on its owner, the harder it is to separate the value of the business from the value of that person's labor, which brings us to perhaps the toughest test of all. Earlier, I asked whether your business could survive without you for 4 weeks, but there is an even harder version of that question. What if you were not coming back at all? Imagine someone walks in tomorrow and says, I want to buy your company. Amazing, right? Yes, I know some of you never want to sell your business, but let's assume for a moment that you do, okay? Someone wants to buy your company, and there is only one condition. That is, 6 months after the sale, you are leaving. So in this scenario, what exactly are they buying? Your customer base, your brand, your processes, your intellectual property, your contracts, a team that knows how to operate the company? Or are they basically buying you? Because if every important customer says, I only work with Sarah, every supplier says, only Sarah handles that, every employee says, you will have to ask Sarah. And the sales process is basically Sarah somehow convinces people to buy. Then Sarah is not simply the owner of the asset. Sarah is the asset. And that makes the company much more dependent on one person than it should be. You becoming the irreplaceable part of every transaction might make yourself feel good, but it is also what makes your business much more vulnerable. So let's do a little test to figure out the extent that your business depends on you. Pause the video for a bit and grab a pen and paper and give yourself 1 point for each of the following statement if that is true. Number 1, customers can buy without speaking to me personally. Number 2, routine work can happen without me. Number 3, my staff, employees or contractors can make ordinary decisions without me. Number 4, important processes are documented somewhere other than inside my head. Number 5, customer relationships belong to the company, not exclusively to me. Number 6, sales don't depend entirely on my personal reputation or outreach. Number 7, routine financial and administrative work can continue without me. Number 8, someone competent could eventually take over most of my operational role. Number 9, I could disappear for 4 weeks without the business collapsing. And finally, number 10, the company would still have meaningful value to someone if I left permanently. Okay, so what is your score? If you scored 2 or 3, you have probably built yourself a job. If you are somewhere in the middle, you are probably doing what most entrepreneurs need to do, moving from self-employment towards an actual organization. And if you score very highly, you are gradually building something that can exist independently of you. And that's really the goal. Okay, but no worries. Don't take the exact score too seriously because this is not an exact scientific test, obviously. The point is the direction. It is just that ideally you have to improve your score gradually over time. Most entrepreneurs will be self-employed in the beginning, and that's completely normal. In the beginning, you probably should know your customers personally. You probably should understand how every important part of the business works. And yes, for a while, you may have to do a ridiculous number of things yourself. But that should be a stage, not the permanent business model, because the goal is not necessarily to build a huge company, and it is not to remove yourself completely and sit on a beach doing nothing. The goal is much simpler. It is to gradually make the business less dependent on you, and so that eventually you work on it because you choose to, not because every customer, every sale, every decision, and every problem has to pass through you. And so maybe that is the best question to end the video with. If you stepped away tomorrow, what would still be left? If the answer is customers, systems, processes, a brand, capable people, and something that can continue creating value, then you are building an asset that exists beyond your own labor. But if nothing moves until you come back, you may have become your own boss, but you are still your own employee.